It begins not with stone, but with silence the kind that lingers after conquest. When the fields of Britain breathe again beneath uneasy skies, the year is around 757. The heart of England beats within the kingdom of Mercia, a realm of mist, river, and power. And at its center stands King Offa, a name whispered with both reverence and fear. To his enemies, he is a tyrant cloaked in piety. To his people, a ruler chosen by destiny. Offa was not born into stability, he forged it from rebellion. When he took the throne, Mercia was splintered, its throne contested, its borders fading like mist before the morning sun. Yet within 2 decades, Offa had transformed it into the dominant power of Anglo-Saxon England, a realm that rivaled Charlemagne's across the sea. But even a king of iron hearts and golden crowns knew one truth. A kingdom without walls is a dream waiting to be stolen. Offa's ambition burned beyond the sword, it sought permanence. The stories of Rome still echo through the monasteries and markets. Tales of emperors who shaped the earth itself to mark their dominion. Perhaps Offa listened. Perhaps, in his halls of Tamworth or his palace at Sutton Walls, he dreamed of a monument that would outlive flesh and fame. A boundary not just of defense, but of divine order. For in the west lay Wales, the rugged home of the Britons, descendants of Rome's broken legions, and of the ancient gods the Saxons feared and scorned. Between Mercia and Wales ran no clear line, only forests, rivers, and blood. Raids burned villages, theft bred revenge, and faith divided neighbors. Offa's Dyke would change that. It would carve a mark of destiny between two worlds, the land of the English and the land of the old gods. Yet, a wall is never just earth, it is intent. To build such a thing in the 8th century was to command not only men, but nature itself. The chronicles tell us little. The silence of history speaks louder than the scribes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that loyal servant of the English, mentions Offa's Dyke only once briefly, as if the enormity of it was too vast to be captured in ink. Others wrote later, in awe and mystery. A great ditch, they called it, between Wales and Mercia, but the purpose, defense, dominance, or divine boundary is left time to guess. Offa himself left no explanation, no boast in stone. Only the Dyke remains a scar across 177 miles of earth, like a heartbeat fossilized in soil. Imagine the moment of its conception. Offa, standing upon a high ridge, his cloak whipped by the western wind. Before him, the hills roll into the wild Welsh frontier mist, curling around oak and heather. Behind him, his courtiers and soldiers wait silent. He looks west, and perhaps he sees not just danger, but chaos. Paganism still breathes beyond that horizon, wild as the mountains themselves. Offa, a Christian king, seeks order to bind chaos under heaven's eye. And so, he draws the invisible line, a vision to be carved into earth by thousands of hands. A wall, not of stone, but of soil and soul. And so it began. Men came from across Mercia, farmers, slaves, soldiers, to dig, pile, and shape the land itself. From the River Dee in the north to the Severn in the south, the Dyke crawled like a serpent through the borderlands. It took years, maybe decades. Entire villages rose and fell in its shadow, and though it was called a boundary, it became something more, a symbol of Offa's rule, of Mercia's might, of the fear and faith that defined an age. When the final mound was raised and the last shovel struck the soil, Offa's Dyke was not just a wall, it was a statement to eternity. For kings die, kingdoms fade, but the earth remembers, and the land itself now carried the mark of one man's dream and one nation's division. The Britain of Offa's age was not a united island, but a tapestry torn and rewoven by centuries of conquest. The Romans had come and gone, leaving behind roads, ruins, and ghosts, yet no peace. In their absence, new powers rose from the ashes. The Anglo-Saxons warlords turned kings, settlers turned sovereigns. They brought with them their gods, their language, and their hunger for land. From across the cold sea, they came in waves, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and carved their kingdoms into the flesh of the old Celtic lands. By the time of Offa, England was divided into 7 crowns, the Heptarchy, each king clawing for supremacy: Northumbria, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Mercia. Among them, Mercia stood proud and brutal, the heart of England, both in geography and in ambition. Mercia's western border, however, was never still. Beyond its edge lay the Welsh kingdoms Powys, Gwynedd, and Dyke, remnants of the old Britons, who had once ruled all of Britain. To the English, these were the Wheelers, the strangers, the foreign ones. Though they were the island's original sons, they were Christian, yes, but not in the Roman way. Their priests still whispered prayers in ancient tongues, their crosses carved with spirals of older faiths. Their warriors fought not only for land, but for memory, for the right to remain themselves in a world being rewritten by Saxon steel. Between Mercia and Wales, border raids were constant, brutal, and merciless. Farms burned, churches were plundered, cattle stolen, and king avenged. The land itself became a battleground where every valley carried a story of betrayal. Offa watched this chaos, and in it, he saw not just danger, but opportunity. The dike was his solution, not merely a defense, but a declaration. By drawing a physical line, Offa sought to impose order upon chaos, to tell his enemies, his subjects, and perhaps even God himself, where Mercia ended and where the wild began. Yet, that line also cut through lives. Whole communities found themselves divided, one brother in Mercia, another in Wales. Ancient paths of trade and pilgrimage were severed. The dike was not just an engineering feat, it was a scar upon the human heart. And like every scar, it told a story of both injury and endurance. Some chroniclers suggest that the dike may have been less a defensive barrier and more a political message, a gesture of dominance, a claim to the land between two peoples. Others whispered that it was meant to impress Charlemagne, Offa's continental rival, proof that the English could match the grandeur of Rome. But in truth, no record remains of Offa's words. The silence of the king leaves us with only the soil to speak for him. Still, to understand Offa's world, one must understand his faith. The 8th century was an age where the old gods had not yet fully died. Pagan rituals still flickered in the corners of Christian kingdoms, in the midsummer fires, in charms murmured over cattle, in the reverence for sacred groves and stones. The line between Christian king and pagan warlord was thin and often blurred. Offa presented himself as the defender of the faith. He minted coins, bearing his image beside that of the archangel Michael, and built monasteries to anchor his divine authority. Yet his methods were far from saintly. Power and piety walked hand in hand, and both demanded sacrifice. To rule in this world was to wield both the sword and the cross, and Offa wielded them with equal precision. But the dike was not made of faith or blood alone. It was built by hands. The laborers who dug it, farmers, slaves, soldiers, left no names behind. They worked in mud and rain, shaping earth that would outlast their bones. In their toil, they bridged the world of kings and the soil of the people. Every mound they raised became a verse in an unspoken epic, one written not in ink, but in the shape of the land itself. The dike stretched onward, through hills and valleys, through forest and meadow, as if the earth itself obeyed Offa's will. And yet, beyond it, the Welsh still stood fierce, free and unbroken. The wall did not end the raids, nor did it steal the old songs that drifted from the mountains. Instead, it became a stage where two worlds, divided by faith, language, and pride, would gaze across at one another for 1,000 years to come. And in that uneasy silence between mound and meadow, between Saxon and Briton, a new legend began to grow. For walls may divide, but they also define. And Offa's dike, in its long shadow, began to define England itself. When the idea of the dike took form, it was more than a command. It was a vision that reshaped an entire horizon. From the River Dee in the north to the Severn in the south, a line nearly 177 miles long was drawn across the living body of Britain. It was to follow the spine of hills, to trace ridges where the eye could watch the west, and where the earth itself could be turned into fortress. There was no blueprint, no parchment plan, only instinct, geography, and the will of a king who sought to leave his mark, not in marble or metal, but in mud and eternity. No one today knows exactly how many men labored to raise the dike, but imagine them thousands of rough hands, gripping spades and picks of iron and wood, cutting deep into the earth, the soil piled high on the eastern side, forming a raised embankment that towered over the ditch to its west. This design was deliberate to give the men of Mercia the advantage of height, to look down upon any who dared approach from the Welsh hills. The dike was not a wall to imprison. It was a statement. We are higher, stronger, chosen. And yet, it was built entirely from the land itself. No stone, no mortar, only soil, shaped into monument. It was a wall not meant to last, and yet it endures. The logistics alone were staggering. For every mile of the dike, thousands of tons of earth were shifted by sheer human strength. There were no beasts of burden to drag the soil, no wheels to ease the labor. It was the sweat of men, the ache of backs, and the rhythm of shovels that turned landscape into legacy. Archaeologists still trace the dike's ghostly path today, through farmlands, beneath forests, even under modern roads. And in its surviving segments, they find layers of clay and turf, carefully stacked signs of method and mastery. This was not the random digging of frightened men. It was engineered. The builders knew the land, how it drained, how it held, how it rose. They read the soil as if it were scripture. But who were these builders? Were they conscripted peasants forced by royal decree? Or perhaps freemen fulfilling service to their king? Some whisper of Welsh captives, digging the very boundary meant to hold their king at bay. The chronicles are silent, yet the human cost would have been immense. For every mound raised, there would have been broken bodies, crushed hands, sunken graves, lives spent upon a wall that would never bear their names. In the soil of Offa's Dyke, the story of power is inseparable from the story of suffering. Offa himself likely oversaw the project, not from afar, but with presence. We know from royal charters that he traveled often along the western frontier, granting lands to monasteries, securing loyalties, and marking borders. It was here, among the rolling hills and misted valleys, that he must have seen the dike take form, his will becoming landscape. To his men, it was a miracle of command. To his enemies, a wound upon their land. Yet, even as the earth rose, the question lingered. What was the dike truly for? If it was a defense, it was a curious one. There were few forts, no watchtowers, no gates along its span. A determined army could cross it with ease. But perhaps defense was never the point. The dike was psychological a message written across the map of Britain. It said to the Welsh kings, "You are beyond, you are other." And to the people of Mercia, it whispered, "We are whole, and what lies beyond is chaos." The dike was not meant to stop war. It was meant to define civilization. Yet, even as the dike rose, so did its mysteries. Some sections veered from the logical path, climbing steep hills when easier routes lay below, tracing ancient trackways whose origins reached far before Offa's reign. Was the dike built upon older boundaries, prehistoric ditches, forgotten tribal lines, or sacred routes once walked by druids? Modern scholars have found traces of earlier earthworks beneath parts of it, suggesting Offa may have built upon the bones of an older world. If so, the dike was more than royal ambition, it was continuity. The king of Mercia had carved his rule into the same ground where ancient Britons had once drawn their circles of power. The past, it seemed, was not erased, only rewritten in deeper lines. And as the final sections neared completion, the dike became both a boundary and a myth. From every hill, it whispered the same message. Here ends one world and begins another. The Welsh would look upon it and call it arrogance, the Mercians' triumph. But the land itself, ancient, patient, knew better. For every wall becomes, in time, a ruin, and every line drawn by kings is eventually blurred by the wind. When the dike was done, Offa stood once more upon his boundary, the wall that bore his name. He looked west into the mist, toward the lands of the Britons, and eastward toward the heart of his realm. In that moment, perhaps he believed he had mastered both, yet history would prove otherwise. For the wall that sought to divide would become the very thread that tied two peoples together in legend and in memory. The earth had spoken, and Offa had inscribed his name upon it. But the question that would echo through centuries was not how he built it, but why. The wall was built to divide men, yet it became a bridge between their ghosts. When the last mound of Offa's dike settled into place, the borderlands fell quiet, not with peace, but with a breath held in suspense. On one side, the Saxon kingdom of Mercia stretched in ordered fields and rising towns, bound by law, church, and king. On the other, the Welsh hills rolled wild and misted, ancient and untamed, where old faiths lingered beneath Christian cloaks. But a line of earth, however vast, cannot silence history, and in the shadow of Off's dike, that history began to whisper again. The Welsh bards sang of the foreign king who cut the land in two, calling him arrogant, a tyrant who defied both God and nature. They said the dike was cursed, that spirits wandered its length, mourning the fields it split, and the blood it cost. In Mercia, the tale was different. Offa's dike was a symbol of civilization, a mark of divine right. Preachers declared it the wall of a Christian king against heathen lands, a bulwark of order against chaos. Two peoples, two truths, both carved into the same soil. For those who lived along its edge, life became something strange. A farmer might wake each morning to see the dike rising like a dark serpent against the dawn. One side of his field lay in Mercia, the other in Wales. Trade continued, for necessity knows no borders. Salt and grain crossed the dike, as did songs, marriages, and secret deals beneath the moon. Soldiers patrolled its ridges, but they too grew familiar with those beyond the ditch. Some even fell in love across the divide. The wall was meant to separate, yet it became the thread binding two fates. And as the decades passed, the dike began to lose its sharpness. Grass grew over its slopes, sheep grazed on its crown, and children played where kings had once drawn lines of power. Still, shadows clung to it. The dike became a place of superstition. Travelers avoided it at night, claiming to see figures walking its ridges under full moons, ancient soldiers, they said, marching silently toward battles long lost. Some called them the ghosts of the Britons, bound forever to the land they could not reclaim. Others said they were Offa's men, cursed to guard the boundary for eternity. Monks passing through the borderlands wrote of eerie lights flickering along the dike's edge, like the souls of the unshriven seeking their way home. In truth, the dike seemed alive, changing with light and season, vanishing into fog, reappearing like a memory. It became a liminal place, neither Mercia nor Wales, neither present nor past. The people began to treat it as sacred in its own way, a reminder of power's impermanence and of the strange beauty born from division. The Welsh poets wove it into their verses, calling it Clod of Fa, the wall of Offa, but speaking of it with the melancholy of loss, not defeat. As the years turned to centuries, Offa's name began to fade from living lips. Mercia itself weakened, consumed by the tides of Viking raids and new kings rising in Wessex. The great dike stood silent through it all, an ancient boundary, now guarding no one. Yet its presence shaped the centuries that followed. The Normans would later march through these same borderlands, building castles where Offa had once dug earth. The English marcher lords would rule from its shadow, blending Saxon, Welsh, and Norman blood. In their veins, Offa's vision of a border both defended and defined would live on. But there was irony in it. One history loves to tell. The Dyke, once meant to mark where England ended, became the very root of the idea of England, itself a land that could be drawn, named, and remembered. The wall that separated became the foundation of identity, and through it, Offa achieved what he perhaps never intended. He gave shape to a nation's soul. Still, as twilight fell upon his kingdom and the years drew him closer to his end, one wonders if Offa ever walked its lengths again. Old now, his power waning, his crown heavy with ghosts. Did he look upon the Dyke and feel pride or doubt? Did he realize that walls are never truly built to keep others out, but to keep something within fear, perhaps, or memory? For when a man builds a wall against the world, he walls himself in as well. The Dyke became not just the story of a king, but of humanity's endless urge to draw lines between us and them. And in that urge, we find both the seeds of empire and the sorrow of exile. But history has its own patience. For in time, the grass grows, and the lines blur once more. And in the mists of the border hills, the old songs of the Britons and the Saxons began to mingle, not in war, but in echo. Time moves like wind across the hills, and even the proudest walls are ground down to whispers. 1,000 years have passed since Offa's Dyke first cut its line through the living land. The kings who ordered it, the hands that built it, the blood that soaked it, all are dust now. Yet the Dyke remains. You can still walk it across ridges crowned with oak, through valleys filled with sheep and shadow. It sneaks through farmland and forest, vanishing and reappearing, like an ancient thought trying to remember itself. In places, it rises high and bold, a man-made hill, against the sky. In others, it hides beneath the roots of trees, barely a ripple in the grass. But no matter how faint, it is there the pulse of a forgotten king still felt in the bones of the earth. Modern travelers who tread the Offa's Dyke path, tracing nearly its entire length, often describe an uncanny feeling, as if they are walking through time itself. Each footstep carries them across centuries. The world of the Saxons, the land of the Britons, the echo of Rome, the silence of prehistory. It is not just a trail, it is a memory, a living boundary between what was and what is. The air feels older there. The wind whispers in two tongues, Welsh and English, and the hills seem to hum with stories that have no end. Farmers still mark their land by the Dyke's curve. Pilgrims still cross it with quiet awe. Few monuments on earth have endured so quietly, so stubbornly, so beautifully. Yet, what Offa built as division has become, paradoxically, a bridge. The Dyke today binds together two nations who once glared at each other across its ridge. It is celebrated not as a scar, but as shared heritage, a symbol of how boundaries can become meeting places. The same soil that once bore the weight of fear now carries the footsteps of hikers, historians, poets, and dreamers. The Dyke is no longer the wall of England. It is the song of both England and Wales, a line of unity born from division. And yet, its presence reminds us of something older, deeper, the impermanence of power. For all his might, King Offa could not hold back time. His kingdom of Mercia, the greatest in its age, crumbled within a generation of his death. His dynasty vanished. His coinage, once bright with his name beside Charlemagne's, lies buried in fields where no crown will ever shine again. But the Dyke, that mute monument of earth, endures. In the end, it was not sword or scripture that preserved his memory, but soil. The land itself became his storyteller. Every empire seeks to leave its mark. The Romans left their walls, the Normans their castles, the Victorians their railways, But Offa's Dyke is different. It was carved from the land, not placed upon it. It reminds us that even kings must work within the bones of the world. And in that humility lies its power. The Dyke is not triumphal. It is patient. It waits. It teaches. It endures. And it tells a quiet truth that power fades, but the marks it leaves in earth, in story, in memory, become the very fabric of the future. Sometimes, on a misted morning, as sunlight breaks over the Welsh hills, you can stand upon the Dyke and see both nations at once, England and Wales, East and West, past and present. There, the line between them seems to dissolve in light. Birds cross it freely, rivers ignore it, the wind belongs to no king. And in that moment, you understand. Offa's Dyke was never just about separation. It was about the eternal dialogue between human ambition and the earth's quiet eternity. The wall remains not as division, but as testimony that even when men draw lines to keep the world apart, the world finds ways to heal. Grass grows over trenches, borders fade into stories, and the land remembers all, without anger, without pride, without end. So when you walk the Dyke today, know that you tread upon a paradox, a wall built to divide that now unites, a scar turned into a seam. You walk in the footsteps of kings, slaves, poets, and ghosts, and beneath your feet lies the heartbeat of 1,000 years, still echoing, still alive. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.